Japan has some fundamental differences to other cultures, and I'm not saying what's good or bad. That's not the point. The point is
different.
The trends are the same globally. Given unplanned childlessness is so prevalent around the world, and the best estimates I see places around 80% of people without children did not plan to be childless. This was what I call unplanned childlessness.
This is Tracy Green, and I've got Stephen Shaw here, and you've made the documentary Birthgap.
Birthgap, Childless World, yes.
Childless World, okay, thank you. And so those who don't know you, you've been on a few podcasts already.
Yes.
And so I'm honored to have you here with me, and we've already spoken offline and had we connected immediately.
We did.
Just, sometimes you meet people and you just connect immediately. That was one of those times. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to have a conversation.
Well, likewise, really.
Thank you. So those who don't know you, maybe give a little bit of your background, your work prior to the documentary, how you got into it, what you learned, anything that you thought going in that maybe you learned differently or something, or just, take me through that process, please.
This could be a long explanation.
That's fine, yeah. We can use the whole podcast doing that, yeah.
I mean, here we are sitting in Tokyo. We've got our own journeys that brought us here.
Yeah.
Maybe that's one of the reasons we connected.
Yeah.
But I never expected this. There was never a moment in my life where this was planned in any way. And I was maybe, I think, 48 or 49 when I first started looking at birth rates. Never for a moment thinking I would make a documentary, move to a different country. I was in the US at the time, quite happily.
And sorry, were you a filmmaker before?
Never. Never. I mean, so at that point, if you told me I was going to make a documentary, I'd have said you're mad. I mean, there's just absolutely no ingredient in my history of any kind. I mean, I'm into math and data.
Okay.
But I did think at one moment I might write a book. That would have been a goal. Same kind of goal. I've never run a marathon. I will never do it now. But it was always in the back of my mind that maybe one day I could possibly do that. If I can do a 5K, which I barely can, I might do a 10K, and you never know. I mean, documentary is way beyond marathon level for me. Way far beyond.
So not in your wildest dreams?
No, there's no reason
Not
to. I'm, the closest thing would be I've liked photography since childhood.
Okay.
But video, no, not my area, not my expertise. Why would I? But what happened was when I had the realization that there's an important book that needed to be written about birth rate decline around the world, because no one was really looking at this from a global perspective.
Yeah.
My second son told me, Dad, younger people don't read books anymore. Make a documentary. At that point, I was like, well, okay, there's no hope now. If I write a book, young people who I wanted to reach, we're never going to read it, and I know nothing about documentary or filmmaking. But there was one day, I don't think I've told this story in full before. I thought maybe I might know someone who knows someone. I was curious, and I opened up my contacts on probably Facebook at the time. And, letter A, the first person who came up was a woman called Annie. And I'd met Annie, I think, randomly at an airport waiting for a flight. And she was from the US and had just been finishing work experience somewhere in Europe and connecting. And she mentioned that she was doing something media related, or that she knew people. I just got a feeling if there's anybody who might know anybody, A is a good place to start in this list, and let's contact Annie. I pinged her a message saying, Annie, we talked once. I'm looking for someone who might have any experience in Europe in filmmaking. And she said, oh, no, but I know someone in Washington, D.C. called Elise. Well, her name was Elise Mueller. She's now Elise Mueller-Cosgrove.
Okay. Who
became my cinema photographer. And it was just the most incredible connection. She's the only person I sent a message to, Annie, looking for help to find someone. And the message came instantly back, you should talk to Elise. I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And then when I had a conference call with Elise and Annie, it's like, okay, I've got this really weird project. I want to go around several countries and talk to people about birth rates And they were like, why would you want to talk about that? But here we are, I still work with Elise. She became a core member of my team. And through her, doors opened to meet more creative people.
Oh, yeah.
And I was pulled into that world. The first project we did was filming in the US, and it was so amateur. The second we decided, okay, let's go to Europe, rent a car.
Yeah.
And at that point, my thinking was, I'm going to use this footage for my research. Instead of taking notes when people are talking, which would have been distracting.
Yeah.
And I can't read my own writing anyway.
Same here.
Well, okay, got a videographer who can kind of record it all. But I think from the second or third interview we did, people started to open up about their personal lives, and I got pulled into it. And I think Elise and I both realized this is a documentary. And 4 years later, I finished it. 2 years of editing, which I never had planned for. I thought it was a 1-year project. It happened to transform my life. It brought me to Japan.
Yeah.
And the documentary, we went to 24 countries. We went to 27 countries. A few countries I didn't actually film in, but 24 countries we interviewed in. And here I am living in Tokyo.
Yeah, and you've been here 5 years?
Yeah, nearly 6 now, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I came back in 2014.
Okay.
And it's been almost 9 years now. In May, it'll be 9 years. So, and I love it. Love it.
Me too.
But so Japan is a very unique place. What has surprised you about Japan coming here?
I came to Japan for the first time for a 3-month, this part of an MBA program I was doing, international business program. That would have been in 94. And I spent 3 months, and I enjoyed it here, but I didn't connect with the country. At that time, all of the signage was all in kanji characters.
Yep.
You had to count the subway stops because you couldn't read the signs to know when to get off the subway.
Yep.
And because I was younger, probably, I felt there's a barrier to Japanese people. English was really not spoken at all. So I liked Japan, but I didn't connect with Japan. When I came back, I was actually on vacation with 2 of my kids in 2016, but intending to, through curiosity, understand why are people having so few children in Japan. But I brought 2 of my kids, and I realized everything changed. First of all, they've got like Roman alphabet on the subway stations. That helps. Google Maps helps as well.
Oh, it's great. Fantastic.
Yeah, but actually, Japanese people do speak a little bit of English, and usually they're shy about it.
Yeah.
But if you're prepared to, show that you're going to talk slowly, you can communicate.
Yeah.
And then I discovered a whole rich culture in Japan I really connected with. People ask a lot why I'm here. Japanese people want to know why I'm here.
Yeah.
And the first thing is Japanese people. They're very selfless people, very kind people. They caring. But in the same way, they've got a great sense of humor. This comes out as well. It's like, this is really interesting to me because I really connect with the humor here. Not everyone does, I know that. And of course, it's the safety, the fact that when you go to a cafe here, but people don't maybe know, you can leave your laptop on a table outside the cafe.
Yeah.
You can go and order, and you're not thinking for a moment, is my laptop going to be there? Because it's going to be there.
Yeah.
It's so safe here. It's incredible.
Oh, heck yeah. I had an expensive bottle of wine as a souvenir for a friend. And I had an extra 30 minutes before we were supposed to meet. So I sat down in a Starbucks and I put the wine on the floor like an idiot.
Yeah, which you don't do in Japan.
Time comes, I get up and run to meet my friend. I get on the bus. I go halfway to my destination and realize I forgot the wine. So I get off, get on a bus going back, go back to Starbucks. The wine was sitting there under the table.
Yeah.
Expensive bottle of wine.
Yeah.
And I said to the couple that was sitting there, I said, is there a bottle of wine under there? They said, oh, there is.
Yeah.
And they handed it to me, and I left and went to see my friend.
Yeah.
A tire store near my home here in Tokyo, tires are very expensive, and they service luxury cars like Lexus and Mercedes, and they'll get their delivery at 10 p.m. at night, and they'll leave several $1,000s worth of tires on the curb on a busy street.
All night.
And they're there in the morning.
Yes.
And they're there 2 weeks later.
Yes.
It's incredible.
Another example for me, I once went to an ATM here, and I don't know, I was juggling lots of things, my cell phone, but I set the credit card on top of the ATM, and I left. And 5 minutes later, I rushed back, and it was gone. I was like, oh my gosh, it's been stolen. I went to the stores nearby, and they said, oh, it'll be in the local little police cabin. I said, well, no, there's no way 5 minutes ago I left my credit card. There's no way. Who would have taken it to the police? No, it will be in the police cabin. I went there, and it was there.
Wow.
And then, it was explained that Japanese people have this responsibility. If they find something valuable, whatever they're doing, they have the responsibility of taking that to the local police cabin. And, there's nowhere else in the world. I think, and in terms of cleanliness, I remember meeting someone from Switzerland here. And I think most of us think of Switzerland as one of the most pristine countries anywhere.
Alps, the snow, the water, right?
Yes, everything. But someone from Switzerland was here and was in shock, saying, Japan is cleaner than Switzerland. It's more perfect than Switzerland. Wow. There's another side to that. I think you may know too. There's a lot of pressure on Japanese people.
Yes.
To make things perfect.
Yes.
And that causes things like working extraordinary hours. So perhaps you and I are a little lucky seeing the benefit of some of these things. But there is a bit of another side to it. But
there is, yeah.
It's really connected me with life, with Japan, and just the culture here. Rather, it's a culture I've connected with. Yeah, and I don't plan to leave. It's so
good. I don't blame you. I don't plan to leave either. I'll probably retire and be. I was gonna say be buried here. I'll probably be cremated here.
Yeah, I can see that happening to me too.
Yeah. So I first came to Japan in 1990 and stayed here for 10 years. Went back to the States. Once again in 2014, I came back, and I've been here ever since 2014. And I've seen dramatic changes in those two stints in Japan, to almost 10 years each. But when I first came here, I met a man, he was maybe 45 or 50. I was in my early 20s. And he'd retired from a very successful career at a big company, and he had started his own trading company or import-export company. And I said, well, how'd you do it? What did you do to get where you are? Because I was young. I was interested in maybe entrepreneurship or at least getting rich, whatever that means. And he said, well, my boss, when they first hired me at this big company, told me two things. Number one, get married. Number two, have a family. That's the only career advice he got from his boss.
Wow.
And it was almost, he explained it almost as if it was a duty to get married and have children. And so he did. And of course, I'm sure he worked extremely hard, because you don't get to the top by doing nothing, right? But haven't heard anybody say that this time.
No.
In fact, the end of lifetime employment, I don't want to paint too bleak of a picture, because at the end, I hope we get some possible solutions, or, maybe possible good things happen. At the end of lifetime employment, people are not getting married. They're putting off marriage in Japan, which means, there's a downward spiral in consumer spending. If you don't get married, you don't need to buy a home. A lot of people into their 30s live with their parents. If you don't have children, you don't buy all the baby stuff, like the baby carriage or the pram, right? You don't buy diapers, you don't buy toys, you don't send them to school, you don't buy children's clothes. So there's that downward consumer spending cycle, and then companies lose money, so they lay people off, and then people are worried about the future, and then they spend less money. And when Japanese worry about something, when they panic, they save money. They don't spend. So I'm seeing that happen. That's a few things if you want to make a comment on that. Or even if I'm wrong, just push back.
I think there are shifts around that. You're saying, sure, that, for example, people are not buying as many prams or diapers. Sure, that's true. But when people are not married, often they're either, you can't generalize. There's different categories. Categories that are difficult. But there's those people who enjoy those years for things like travel.
True.
Or things like, updating their wardrobes perhaps more often than they otherwise would. But there's also people, like you say, the ones perhaps living with their parents still. The terminology is difficult because each country's got its own terminology. But the geeks here, they kind of otaku.
Otaku, yeah.
Yeah, they worry me. It's all around the world. These young men, often who are either gaming all day,
Yep.
or here going into cultures that's difficult to explain. But the AKB culture, these young women who sing songs on TV, and you have the whole fan base, all young men.
Oh yeah.
Devoted to this young woman.
Oh, it's like a cult following, almost like
cult.
If you know the Grateful Dead. They had their followers who, that was a different kind of follower,
Yes.
much more devoted follower. But these idols, they call them.
Yes.
AKB 47.
Yes, 48.
48, sorry. Yeah, that's how out of the loop I am.
I had to learn. Yeah.
But these guys, they collect their merch. They buy their books. They'll do like a swimsuit issue of like a 50-page book, and it'll be like $100. And they all buy it.
Yeah.
They'll buy their CDs. They'll buy a T-shirt with their face on it. They'll buy any magazine that has them in there. They'll buy it. It's a massive marketing thing. So
and just explain, this is a television kind of knockout where you start with 48 young women who are singing and performing, and I think every week one or two gets knocked out over a series. But they also do their live shows. So these young men come to theaters and line up and pay extraordinarily high prices to do this. But someone explained to me, Japanese young woman, that no, these men actually love. This is love that they have. They experience their feeling. That may or may not be true, but I worry that this culture is an indication of a broader malaise amongst young men worldwide. In Japan, it's brought out in different ways, like we've just been explaining. But around the world, we have things like incels. We have men going their own way. There's a lot of problems around the world with men, young men. And I'm saying this as an older man, but I'm hearing it a lot from women who are looking to date and find a young man.
Yes.
And the balance is off. And in Japan, the balance is off in a uniquely Japanese way.
Yeah.
But the balance is off everywhere. It happens to be that each culture, I feel, it's portrayed, it's realized in perhaps somewhat of a unique way. So the trend is global. So we talk about Japan often in a way it's quirky, and maybe it is, but the trends in Japan are no different to the trends elsewhere.
That's true. And if we, going back to dating, I've been out of the dating world for about a decade now, and but I read a lot, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I hear people in the U.S. talking about dating apps, and they talk about the older men are meeting younger women, which means the younger men are not meeting women. And, maybe a guy who's 30, 35, has his own home, has a nice car, has a career, and he gets on a dating app, and there's a 22-year-old girl who's there swiping left, swiping right, and what chance does that young man that's her age have against that 35-year-old guy with the home and the car and the career? Yeah. And so I could see, and I saw this because when I was in high school, the college boys were dating the girls my age, and I was bitter. And when I got to college, I thought, well, I can finally date somebody in college. Well, no, now the guys with careers are dating the college girls. This is before the internet. Today, I just assume it's much worse. It's where...
No, it is. So making the documentary, I spent a lot of time getting to know, as best I could, younger people. I'm divorced, so it allowed me to kind of 2 a.m. still be out somewhere in some place just talking to young people without someone calling me saying, where are you? Yeah. I realized recently that had been a benefit probably. But two comments on this. I was out on a Friday night in an area where a lot of students live in Tokyo near Shinjuku. Okay. And it was a British pub, and there was a bunch of young men, college age, playing pool. And I asked them, Friday night, guys, why are you all here? Why are you not out with girls? Where are the girls? And one of them looked at me curiously and said, it's not our time. We're not, the girls are out with the older guys. They're out for the dinners, at the nice restaurant that college kids can't afford. Yep. But it was black and white. It was like I was the idiot asking them, where are the girls? It's like, well, they're not ready, you know. And I had this actually last week. I was in a Spanish restaurant here. And just to explain, you will maybe know, food from all over the world is simply better in Japan. They take
it's amazing.
They take Italian food, they take Spanish food, and they lift it to a level. So we're
Yes.
not here always eating Japanese food.
No.
So I was in a very nice little Spanish restaurant, and I was talking to the waiter. He's a young man, maybe 22. I've met him a few times about this exact subject. And again, he blanked when I asked him, was he planning to marry or was he dating? And it's like, we can't even start to think about the possibility of dating until he thought 30 to 35 was when he might start seriously dating.
Wow.
He wants to be a hairdresser, so he has to study. Earnings for that are not great at the start.
Yeah,
so it's like, okay, that gets me to the 30, and maybe I'm at my own place 35. So it's not that they can't date.
Yeah.
They're not even trying to date.
They're kind of demoralized then.
They're
kind of given
demoralized,
up.
right? Absolutely. But this doesn't benefit everyone because, you know, the 35-year-old male or 30-year-old or 40-year-old
Sure.
Who can date younger women is probably having a date with a new woman every week because he can.
Sure.
There's no reason to kind of develop a relationship often.
Oh, yeah.
So in the end, nobody really wins in this culture that we've created.
Also, you get the 22-year-old girl when she's 25. No, when you're 22 and you're cute, you can go to a coffee shop or a nightclub or anywhere and meet a guy. It's not that hard when you're 22 and cute. But when you're 25, it gets a little more difficult. When you're 30, it gets a little more difficult because the guys who used to, I'm a guy, so I can't really say for sure, but I'm assuming when you're 22 and cute, then one day you wake up when you're 30 years old and you're used to being able to get any guy you want. But those guys are still hitting on 22-year-old girls. And now you're 30. And your choices are more limited. And what I like about data, and we didn't go into your career before filmmaking, before this, but we can do that a little bit. But what I like about data is it's agnostic. It's not political. And so when I discuss observations like this, I try to keep it as like, okay, this is just data. This is just an observation I made. And so, you know, that's just what I've noticed. And when I was here in the 90s, it seemed like everybody was dating. And everybody my age was, you know, I knew guys who came over to teach English. And the first thing they do, they get a job, get an apartment, and then meet somebody. And everybody had a girlfriend. And they're in their early 20s. These days, I know a lot of guys. Two things: they're either married or not dating.
Well,
but I'm sure there are people dating. I'm just not in that world.
No,
so
it's a huge problem. Dating today is exceptionally difficult. So one fact I've learned relatively recently from several sources is that on dating apps, at least outside Japan, there are 3 times more men than women on dating apps.
I believe it. And are those women actually human beings or bots?
Well, yeah, I'm sure that's a factor too. But the dynamic is wrong because you've got the bottom half, however you define that, as women would define it, almost getting no swipes.
Oh, yeah.
And you have the top that all the women are attracted to get the men are getting multiple swipes. So, for example, I know someone here who is an attractive man in his late 30s who has paid some premium plan on one of these apps. He wakes up every morning and he's got maybe a dozen women, all attractive, wanting to ping. He chooses the one, and the next weekend, the next weekend.
Yep.
And for him, he's not even looking for this, but why wouldn't he explore?
Well, if it's handed to you, not many guys have the willpower to say, I shouldn't do that.
Yes,
right?
but it's just that if you look at the dynamics overall,
Yeah.
you have these men who are getting lots of dates.
Yep.
You have these women who are being frustrated because they're getting one date once in a while and thinking this guy might like me, not knowing what, you know, this man's intentions are.
Not really sure, yeah.
Yeah. Then you have men who are getting no dates. And then you've the women who are not on these apps. Clearly, there's more men than women who don't perhaps have the opportunity to meet people. The dynamic is fundamentally wrong. I mean, we met at a place last week, a little Can we say it was like
Yeah.
a filmmaker event?
Filmmaker. Actually, we should give him a shout out.
Yeah, we should. Blink Roppongi is the place, and once a month, one of the film schools here.
That's right. Elf.
Yeah, that's right.
Go to meetup.com, look for filmmakers, and they have a meetup every month. But that's where we met.
That's where we met, and I was interested. I don't really consider myself, a filmmaker, but I like I am now. I know
You've
I am.
made a documentary.
But
You're
you
a
all
filmmaker.
studied. You kind of went in that path, and it was a nice evening. But I used the same space 2 days later for an event, and it was the first event globally. I'm calling them the Birthgap Chats. So if I can give a call out to that, because since then, I'm telling people around the world, if you want to have a local Birthgap chat. So what this was we should explain, it's a space for maybe 30, 40 people, although I think there's like 60 that we met.
Blink?
Yeah, Blink.
It's a co-working space and an event space.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a cafe, there's a bar area, there's a screen. It's cozy.
It's great.
The event I held was around 15 to 20 people who some knew each other and some didn't. What I wanted to do in these Birthgap chats is show part of the documentary, for part one, and then next month we'll do part 2 and part 3. But then we had a conversation about the topic, and the topic this past week was, can we solve this problem, the birth rate crisis? And I didn't know how it was going to work, but what was really interesting, people kind of circulated and talked about this and talked and talked and talked. I didn't have to really engage at all.
Yeah.
And then I realized these people are actually really making connections that they wouldn't have otherwise done. And the best thing for me was there's a group of 5 or 6 of us went out afterwards until about midnight. But, it's like, I could see some maybe couples forming there. It was... And through the Birthgap chats, it's not only for that; it's to bring people in communities together. That's what's missing.
Oh yeah, well, especially after the whole pandemic thing. I mean, those meetups. I went to that filmmakers meetup, and I was just so happy to meet human beings.
Yes.
Just talk to. My only interactions I have are with cashiers at 7-Eleven.
Yes.
For the past 2-3 years, or the Amazon delivery man.
Yes.
Who rings the bell and leaves it on your doorstep and just takes off.
Yes.
Right. Other than that,
Yeah, it's a strange world, but so that certainly the pandemic made it worse.
But this happened way before the pandemic. I mean, it started in 1974, right?
Oh, the crisis, yes.
Yeah.
So, and that's the heart of what I discovered in the documentary. But I suppose just if I can close out the point about bringing people together and dating, there's a huge void now. Dating apps, I feel, are in some ways stale.
Yeah.
And to have local events to bring people together,
Yeah.
I happen to have a documentary that might be interesting to people to start conversations.
Yeah.
And I'm promoting that as something that in part one, anyone in the world can create one of these at no cost. Just to hopefully bring community together.
Yeah.
Now, going back to 1974, something fascinating to me is that, my background is data.
Yeah.
We talked about that a couple of times, exceptionally briefly, because that's what I did for more than 20 years. I run a small company, a niche company in the automotive industry. We do forecasting on car sales at a very granular level. And we use big data for that to crunch numbers, to predict weeks out what's going to sell and where. And as a person involved in prediction and forecasting, I had noticed that there's something really strange going on, because I would have expected I would have known in the world I'm in about falling birth rates. And that means fewer people to become workers, fewer people to buy cars. But not only did I not know about this before the project, the executives I interface with from time to time, no one's thinking about this. No one's preparing for this in the entire automotive industry. I know this. I get to interface with some exceptionally senior people around my predictions. So this was a realization that I'm not thinking about it, but also the executives in the automotive world who have to make long-term plans. You're thinking, where am I going to build factories 5 years out, 10 years out? What are the trends going to be? They're not thinking about it. And therefore, I think probably no one's thinking about it. And I think that was absolutely the case. When I saw data about falling birth rates in Europe, I knew about Japan. We all think Japan's a little bit quirky. That's just a Japan thing.
Yeah.
So I knew about falling birth rates in Japan. But I didn't know the same thing was happening in Germany and Italy and Spain and Switzerland and Austria and Portugal. And then I saw it was happening at the exact same moment in time as Japan.
Wow.
So from a data point of view, you start to think, wait, there's a connection here. You know, this is not random. You know, if there's some other event, I mean, the pandemic is actually a good example. You know, we saw the pandemic start in certain places.
Yeah.
I remember thinking of going to Italy for a ski trip with my kids, and I heard it was happening there, and I changed my plans. And suddenly it spread. It was everywhere. At no point in time did we look at that and think, oh, this might be a different, you know, cause. It might be a different virus in all these countries.
Yeah.
It was obvious it started and it was spreading. Well, if you look at the demographic time clock, which is a little bit slower than viruses, but it was the same trend. It was starting in places, different places, but then spreading within those countries and around the world. So to me, it became rather obvious that there's a trend here, but it wasn't a global trend because we didn't have the exact same thing happening in France and the UK and Europe. You didn't have the same thing certainly happening in the US and Canada. So it was intriguing from a data problem. But it's a problem I felt was solvable. You know, we can identify things that are similar between Japan and Italy, say. And back to 74, you know, there was a moment I realized I pretty much knew the month in 74 in Japan. July 74, birth rates fell. And at a national level, in one singular month. And I wanted to know, was this a national trend, or was it, was it Tokyo and Osaka only, or you know, or the more rural areas?
Sure.
You know, was it happening up north in Aomori? You know, or how did this evolve? And it turned out it was happening in every single prefecture in Japan in the same month of July 74.
So that would mean that what's the gestation for a child? Japan, they say 10 months. In America, we say 9 months.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Japanese say 10 months.
Okay.
America, we say 9 months. But so that would mean 9 months before July. That would be
October 73. So, you know, I was working backwards from the data.
Yeah.
And you know, I would have been a very young child in 73, but I had no clear memories of what was going in the world around 73. So I had a researcher working for me, a young Japanese woman who, during COVID times, it was difficult to do research. You had to make a booking to go to the local library, the Japanese National Library. Because of COVID, they only took a certain number of people at a time. So this was maybe booked 10 days out. So she goes to the library, and I told her to look what's happening in July 74. There must be something in July 74. And she texts me saying, I've been here for 2-3 hours and there's really nothing interesting happening. There's some news about this and that. I was like, that's it. I'm like, oh, 9 months before.
Yeah.
Look at October 73. I'm like, idiot. And she texted back within 20 minutes. Global oil shock all over the news. Food shortages across Japan. Japan's in panic. Japan was, at the time, the world's biggest oil importer. It was going through a boom. There were some stresses in Japanese society around that time. There was rising costs, and so people's mindset was challenged. There weren't enough kindergarten spaces. More women were starting to work, and then the oil shock happens, and boom.
No more kids.
Well,
or at least it dropped.
Well, actually, this is interesting too, because if you had one child, only one, the number of people with one child going for a second child increased quite significantly, or quite notably. Those who had 2, 3, 4 more had the same, no change. So something in the psyche was, okay, if we've got one child, we probably want to, maybe we should do it now for you know, maybe things are going to, I don't know, I almost don't want to speculate, but it's interesting. But those who had no children, the number of new mothers plummeted. And to put that in context, in 1973, around 3-4% of Japanese women were societally childless. You know, 4 years later, that was up to 25%, and it then went straight up to 30%. Demographics change slowly. Demographics change over very long periods of time, decades usually. This happened in a 4-5 year period. But back to July of 74, it was an instant reaction. And it was not cities, it was a shock, and I call it the baby shock. So, And I should point out, we don't have quite the same level of granularity in Europe, But at the exact same time, we saw that the same thing happen in Italy and multiple countries across Europe.
So was this oil shock the
oil shock shocks cause? Now let me get this right. Economic shocks cause baby shocks. Now that gets interesting as to why. It gets very interesting, particularly because once those shocks happen, you don't ever return to the prior state.
Oh,
so what we have now is what we have now are multiple cultures around the world where we have, let's say, a third of women becoming childless. The debate, and it's a big debate, is whether that's by choice or not by choice. And that's a whole other conversation. But can I just say one thing, because I try and always make this point. I heard a comment recently, and I expected this. To me, it's sad that someone said, "Why is a middle-aged, older man going around the world talking about women's issues? You know, who's this guy who went to 24 countries? This is a women's thing." 90% of the people I met in the documentary are women. My 3 core crew, Lisa I mentioned, but Taylor O'Sullivan, Mia Tanaka, are 3 women. The 5 assistants, the core assistants we use around the world, are all women. So there's a team of 9 people. I was the only man. And it evolved that way. But I think, I remember Elise saying to me, we couldn't be having these conversations. This is women's chat. And somehow I'm getting in on it because I'm just kind of trying to lie low and just ask simple questions.
Yeah.
There were 1 or 2 times where we used a local crew with kind of local, perhaps male camera people. And it was a different dynamic. Yeah. So I don't want to say necessarily that I understand everything about women's issues broadly, and that's not a good word, but I came at it from a point of view that I just want to understand about women's lives. And now we're a bit off topic, but I just want the core point I want to make is, let me put it this way. I interviewed 5 women who chose not to have children. And I support them. And I support every woman, every person who says, do you know what? I do not want kids. Yeah. In fact, I'll be their biggest supporter because it's not right to coerce people to have children who don't want them. I just want to make that point because, when I'm getting into analysis of what the reasons might be, going back to 1974, there was a baby shock in Japan that's still here today. Yeah. I think it's very hard to imagine that was by choice. To me, it started through circumstance, through economic fears.
Sure.
And you can wind forward and try to understand why that's still the case today. To me, in simple terms, it became the societal norm for people to date later. We've talked about men in their 35 and 40-year-olds still dating. Sure. But also for women to start having families later. That's happened.
True.
And what we haven't, I interviewed 5 fertility doctors along my way, including Kim Kardashian's fertility doctor. And if I can give a summary of that, because there's so little knowledge on fertility out there. Women today can do a very simple blood test to perhaps accurately, I don't know, determine the number of eggs they might have at a certain age.
Okay.
And I don't know enough about that to know if that's a good thing or not. But what I do know is there's another factor, egg quality. So, and there's no way to measure that. And there's a third factor, which is the ability to carry a baby to full term.
Yeah.
Now, all those things, those 3 factors directionally get more and more negative as women get older. And it starts younger, a lot younger than people might imagine. And it's not the same for everybody. It's not like there's a magic age that, it's okay to 32 and 35 is fine or 40 is okay. Another statistic around this, more generally, I asked people, I did an online poll. It wasn't scientific, it was just out of interest. I asked maybe 200 young women, I think from the US, what age did they consider there's only a 50% chance that childless women would become parents? At what point is it 50-50?
Yeah.
And I imagine people might have read this question thinking it was about fertility, but it wasn't entirely. The most common answer was 40%. people thought around 40, we've still got a half chance.
Oh.
The actual answer is 30.
Oh.
And the reason it's 30, part of the reason at least, it's not just fertility. In fact, fertility is not the number one reason. What happens in our 30s, oftentimes, is we haven't got a partner at that moment in time that we want to have a child with.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's back to the dating cycle that we've been talking about. And that might be because, well, there's multiple pathways.
So
to
many
child.
reasons, yeah.
Yes, but it might be because there's a breakup. That's common, or a divorce, or the partner isn't at that moment ready to have a child.
Right,
I have to tell one story briefly about a conversation I had last night with a couple who were dating for 10 years, married for 10 years, late 30s. The woman's age 37. She says to her husband, okay, I think I'm ready to have a child now. They had never talked about children. They'd been married for 10 years.
Never talked about it.
Never talked about it. And he said to her, but he said, I don't want to have kids. I thought you knew that.
Oh.
Which led very quickly to a divorce. This shocked woman.
Oh my gosh.
And she's now 41.
Yeah.
And looking for a partner to have a child with. Wow. That is not uncommon.
Wait. They were married 10 years, probably dated a little bit of time before that, who knows?
Probably.
Never talked about children.
Never talked about children. And it's not unique. I have a scene in the documentary where actually I'm filming a couple in Thailand. And
yes,
the woman has told me, and she's 44, I think. She's told me, because she was actually a translator for me making the documentary, and we were having this kind of chat between interviews. Oh yeah, I really hope you have kids, but I don't know when. I asked her, did you talk about this with your husband? Like, no, we haven't talked about it. And she's 44. So I said, okay, I'm sorry. I actually don't want to talk to you anymore about this because I want to interview you and your husband together. Yeah. And as you know, it becomes a significant scene in the documentary where she actually asks her husband on camera, are we going to have kids? And I'll not give the full answer, but again, it was clear they were really not on the same page at all. So this,
my gosh.
People need to talk about this. It's clear. Why wouldn't you? I think people make a lot of assumptions. Maybe if you don't talk about this in the dating phase early, well, maybe it becomes awkward to talk about.
Okay, so I've been with somebody for actually a month after I came to Japan. I met somebody. We're still together, and the second date, I asked her, "Do you want to have children?"
I think that's really important.
Yeah, but see, I come from a religious family, a Christian family, and to me, the object of dating is to assess whether or not that person will be a lifetime partner. Okay. And that's just what I grew up with. So I met her. The first date is, nice to meet you. Let's have a coffee together. Great, that was fun. I want to see you again. The second date was, what are your plans for the future? Do you want to get married? How many children do you want? You're Japanese, I'm American. If this works out, would you come live with me in America? Or would you rather me live in Tokyo together? Well, I'm still in Tokyo, so that's your answer. But she appreciated that. And she said, well, one reason I like you is because you didn't beat around the bush. You didn't waste my time.
Right.
And yeah, when you're young and cute, you can go through that a couple of times. Oh, you wasted my time. Next. But when you get older, you can't afford. Women have a much tighter fertility window than men.
Yes.
Right? And I'm speaking like I know what I'm talking about, right? But I think that's just an observation. But guys, if you're dating a girl and you're not serious about her, you haven't talked about it,
well,
get it together.
I've got a couple of comments around that. And, I find that, first of all, I think the approach of, it can even be first date, just to establish certain things. If you really want kids, or if you really don't want kids, that's fundamental.
Oh,
you need to communicate that quite early on. So I want to talk about men briefly in this context, because you're right.
That's a good idea. two men.
Because the timing's maybe a little different. Women have a tighter fertility window. That's the reality. Men think they can have a kid at any time the clock goes on and on, and
they
we're
think they
okay.
can-
We're okay. We don't have to think about this.
We think we can be Hugh Hefner or something. Or,
right.
You know.
But, put it this way. You're competing with your younger self for the same pool of women. So a guy who's 45 may think he's made it. He's got the house, the career, savings, whatever it is. And he's meeting women who clearly may, on occasion, be interested in him. And then there's this younger guy who comes in who's, almost as successful, perhaps, maybe more successful. And suddenly the tension's always going to go to the younger man, all other things being equal. So the sad reality is, and again, I'll give an example of friends of friends here. I know people from international communities and Japanese and also around the world, so I've got lots of little stories. But one really struck me. There's the two men who are unsure if they want to have children, and they have been throughout their 30s dating. I think probably successfully. They've met people, have had girlfriends, they've had relationships. One of them is a little bit older. He turned 40. And suddenly the number of dates he can get has just plummeted. To the point his friend is getting all the dates now and all the attention because the friend's 37, 38. He's 40. So for him, it was like a stark moment in a woman's mind. Oh, you're 40, that's different. You're like second choice now. And of course, if you're...
Interesting.
Maybe it's one of the reasons. I'm divorced many, many years. And I probably thought when I come to Japan, I might meet someone. I came here 48, 49. I was competing with guys 10 years younger, I guess, and I'm still single now. It's just the way life works out. So men think they may have more time, but we're competing against each other and against, effectively, as I call our younger self. So effectively, what are we trying to do? For those who want children, you're trying to meet up with each other whilst both are in their fertile years. And because women have a shorter cycle, a shorter window, it's really competitive for men. And I think we don't know that. So it affects everybody.
I since I've been out of the dating game, I didn't realize this, but I assume that in my age, if I were to go out, maybe get on an app or go to, I think I've only met women in person, maybe at a college classroom or something, or at, oh boy, I don't even know, school, But I guess if I were to go on a dating app right now, I'm not 6 feet tall, I don't have a Lamborghini, I don't have a 10-bedroom mansion, I'd probably be single. So, but
very probably. I don't mean that against you.
No,
at all. In the slightest, I think you'd be a lot more successful than me. But as you get older, you're competing with younger people, and for men, there is a time clock. Therefore,
sure,
it's a different time clock.
And it's reproduction. Like having children is about health. And, I think a lot of guys focus on, like, I want to get the house, I want to get the car, I want to show that I can provide. But we also don't consider health. So not only is he going to be healthy enough to be a father, to become a father, is he going to be there for the next 20 years to help raise that child, right? So if you look at a guy like me at 53, it's okay, if I have a child right now this year, so I'd be 54 when the child's born, I'd be 74 when the child is in university.
Yes.
And people will say, "Look, you have a great," to my daughter or my son, they would say, "You seem to have a great relationship with your grandfather."
Well, I remember, I was on a date here when I first came to Japan, and the woman was a bit younger than me, and she turned to me and said, I'll never forget, she said, "You'd make a great grandfather." And that just knocked my confidence, like, okay.
Wow.
I think at that time I was late 40s and thinking maybe I'll have some more kids. Maybe I just might. And so there is a time clock for us. But in terms of being around for, I want to empathize with younger people a lot in terms of the economics around this. There's an economic vulnerability
Yes.
particularly for women in starting a family.
Yes.
And that vulnerability, I think, goes back to the oil shock. And by the way, we've also seen the same impact from the 2007-8 Lehman mortgage
Lehman
shock.
What about Fukushima as well?
Well, Japan already had high childlessness at that time. So what happens when you have follow-up crises? It doesn't impact the childless rate because it's already at its ceiling almost.
I don't mean to be glib, but it seems like Japan has this perpetual case of PTSD. I mean, earthquakes, wars, natural disasters. Maybe that's why they have such a good sense of humor, right? I don't know. You got to.
I never experienced an earthquake, a real one, until I came here, and it's a side story, but I came into my apartment and I didn't know there's a loudspeaker system, so there's a warning given, earthquake,
and they're loud too.
They're loud.
They're not quiet,
but they're in Japanese, and I didn't speak any Japanese, so I was like, "What? Who is this voice? What are they saying?" And then everything starts shaking a little bit. And what was remarkable to me was the translation in English came second. So the earthquake's already happening. There's going to be an earthquake in English. It's like, I need to learn some Japanese to understand this.
Well, we get those on our phone, and sometimes you get it like 2, 3 in the morning. And what happens is you get this alarm, and then like half a second later, you get an earthquake.
Yes.
So I don't know how. Maybe it'll get better. Right?
Yes.
But
the PTSD, I mean, the point, bringing me back to a point, the trends on birth rates are actually global. No, I want to say global because people will say, Japan. Well, what about India or sub-Saharan Africa? But they're on the same trend. It's like a roller coaster. The roller coaster has countries like Japan and Italy and Germany in the front car. South Korea up there too. China right there too. It has countries like France and the UK and the US, Canada, somewhere towards the front, but not quite in the front car. And it has India a little bit further back, and then sub-Saharan Africa, they're in the back car. But everyone is going on the same trend. So the growth that we've experienced economically and in population over the past decades in the more developed world, that growth is going to be experienced in India right now, which has just become the world's most populous nation, as well as many countries across Africa.
Yeah.
But birth rates are falling in those countries too. India is already below replacement level. And there are regions, states within India, many of them, already with low birth rates, as low as Europe and Japan.
Wow.
So we can see from data the same trend effectively everywhere, even in those countries that look like they've got growing populations. In reality, India's population is growing only because people are getting older. People are living longer, which is a great thing. But that means
that a TED Talk or something? The presentation where he had the boxes and he would say, "You replace this generation, and this one gets older. This one gets older, and we're living longer."
Yes.
Right. And so, if the population is growing, that means that the 70 and 80-year-olds there are more of them.
Yes.
Like Japan.
Yes.
Or like
I think India is a great example. It's topical right now, becoming so popular. That was Professor Hans Rosling gave that talk, by the way, with the blogs.
And so data-driven, but so easy to understand.
Right. So if you take India, it's a very young country. Well, what does that mean? It means people have still, mostly, thankfully, got several more decades to live through to get to older age. So Professor Rosling calls it filling up. These countries are filling up, not with new people, but with younger people just living out their lives. So right now, the number of old people in India, relatively speaking, is quite small.
Okay.
But wind the clock forward 20, 30 years, there's going to be a lot of old people in India. It's simply people living longer. What I was interviewed yesterday for a news segment about this, and it was all talking about the economic challenges for India now. It's so populous.
Okay.
And I was the one person on the panel saying, but wait a minute, look at the data. The number of births in India has been falling for around 15 years. Falling, that net births. And you can see from the birth rates in all of these states and how that trend is growing, that actually India is going to become the next Japan or Germany or Italy 40, 50 years from now. birth rates are falling. The number of old people is going to be growing.
Yeah.
So even when you look at those countries that are filling up, to
Yeah.
use Professor Rosling's term, we see the same trend. So this is a global phenomenon, not linked to. I have to smile sometimes. People, the one I remember, people make comments after
Yeah.
podcasts, and there's quite a lot of them. The Jordan Peterson one, there's 10,000 comments.
Wow.
Incredibly personal stories. But you get the occasional one, yeah, I understand, but someone said, oh, I think it's because of President Reagan. I'm like, okay, Reagan was, if I remember, 1980 to 88 in the US, and we're talking about falling birth rates in the 70s in Japan, Italy, and Germany. So so my point is...
So he had a time machine.
yeah, a travel machine as well. That, it's natural, I think, for people to find causality, to link things up with data.
Yeah.
I think, if I can say a common one right now, people talk about, for example, falling sperm counts around the world. That this can be one of the reasons.
Yeah.
But actually, falling sperm counts are, relatively speaking, a recent thing. They have been falling for a while, but sperm counts did not fall in Japan, Italy, Germany, and Spain at the same time first.
In 1973.
Exactly, in the same month,
Okay.
and then spread across the world.
Yeah.
Now, so I'm not saying that may not be a related problem. It might be a very big problem.
Sure,
but it's not the cause of what we're seeing in terms of birth rates. Because this trend we can trace all the way back.
So this, it gets a little more bleak. I mean, now it gets into the emotional ramifications, and there's in Japan I see, and this is just what I see. So I know a Japanese probate lawyer, and who deals with elderly Japanese, and there seems to be a loneliness epidemic as well, and a mental health epidemic. I interviewed Vicky Scorgia, and I put you guys in contact.
Yes.
One of the things I love about this podcast is I get these chances to have these conversations. And Vicky is from TEL, and we had a amazing conversation about suicide. And really, I listened back to that, a couple of times. But in Japan, there's the two things. So the overall, the number of suicides has gone down in the past, 50 years, but the number of elderly, and within that, the number of men has increased, and the number of young women. And I don't want to misstate what she said. I think that's what she said, if I remember correctly. But so I happen to know a Japanese probate lawyer, and this is crazy because, Japanese have a very different view of marriage. There was always this arranged marriage, and a lot of times they'll separate romantic love from marriage. You don't always marry the person you love, and you don't always love the person you marry. In fact, you can have this amazing compatibility, passion, love, sex, and then break up to marry somebody who's stable.
Yeah.
And so...
I'd like to maybe... it's really interesting to have a podcast with someone living in Japan, because they bring out certain things about Japan culture.
Sorry if I talk about Japan too much.
If you're interested, I'm interested, because it's a very unique kind of perspective that we might have. I want to broaden it. Sometimes the concept of marriage in Japan is fundamentally different to the concept of marriage in other cultures.
Yes.
And I didn't know that until I came here, because we think marriage, that's two people getting together and having a home and maybe a family, and that's what marriage is. Marriage in Japan has much more formality to it.
Yeah.
It's the process of typically, not always, but typically a woman technically signing to become part of the male family.
The family, yep.
You go to the city hall, and literally there's a book where you're registered, and you transition from your parents' family onto your husband's.
Your husband,
It can't go the other way, but that's very rare. So effectively, the family typically have to approve this. And I have met several people who did not marry because the family didn't approve.
Yeah.
One's a young woman who, to be honest with you, there's no reason she would be single in her mid-30s. The reason was the person she was getting engaged to, she thought
Yeah.
the family met together, including grandparents, extended family, to discuss it. And they did not want to be connected to the other family. It wasn't about the couple. It was that the families had incompatibilities.
Wow.
And she had to tell this young man that she couldn't marry him, but she did not want to tell him that she made up some other reason, that she met someone else, whatever. She's still single. She's still 35, and that was in her early 20s. So just to make the point, the concept of marriage here as a construct is quite difficult. And I wonder, because in Japan, another interesting thing is that the number of babies born outside marriage is exceptionally low. I think it's still 3%, 5% maybe. Same as South Korea, where it's over 50% now in many, many other cultures. It has not risen here. So people say, oh, well, the reason the birth rate's falling in Japan is because people aren't getting married enough. If they marry, they will have more children. But it's not as simple as that, because what I've also seen here, and I think this might be related, young couples, the woman getting pregnant. Because if you're pregnant, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And in Japan, it's actually quite okay to be pregnant and not married, but you must marry at that point. It's like, okay, because the child has to be born into a family.
Well, it's the family register you just talked
about. The family register.
Right?
So that child has to have a family. So it changes the dynamics. And I often wonder, therefore, our younger people deferring marriage because that would mean the family will get involved in decisions. And it's changing. So this is not universal, but it still is present. Well, let's just date together, maybe live together, and if the woman gets pregnant, hey, we're going to go to her parents, and it's a done deal.
Wow.
So, my summarization of Japanese culture is from my lens, my perspective. Other people may have here much deeper and richer perspectives on it. But again, back to if we now broaden this to a global perspective, here we have a country with a very different concept of marriage and dating and having children inside or out of marriage, but we have the same birth rate trend as Italy and Germany at the same time. So this is where we have to be very careful about drawing conclusions that, the marriage rate in Japan is the problem. No, it's not. It's just a cultural artifact.
So, but it just seems like there's such a complicated system. There's so many moving parts to it. It's so hard to say, like, okay, well, this is because the birth control pill, because they didn't get it till the 90s in Japan, right?
Right.
And a lot of women say that they take it for their skin, and then when they get married and stop taking it, they can't get pregnant.
Can I tell you something that shocked me?
Yeah.
And I've been here 5-6 years studying this.
Yeah.
And I learned this 10 days ago. The number of women taking the pill in Japan is 3%. 3%. 3%. In other countries, I think I've heard 70%. I mean, I had just made the assumption that you're right. It was not made available in Japan until around 1990. And that's another story why it was delayed, because the pill was available in the 70s or maybe before in many other nations.
Well, and even then, doctors would tell women, you don't want to take this. Use another form of birth control. Don't take this. We don't know what it's going to do to you long term.
Well, that culture is still there, and I didn't know it until a young woman, friend of a friend, was telling me she wasn't feeling well. And because I have this kind of conversation with people, she said, I get these monthly cramps and whatever. And she said, I stopped taking the pill last summer. It's like, I understand. Like, why did you stop? I said, well, none of my friends take it. And it's like really annoying every day I have to remember. And sometimes I forget, and it's like, it's just too complicated. But I said, well, what do you mean none of your friends take the pill? It's like, Japan, no one takes the pill. And I went back and checked data. It's 3%.
3%. That's interesting.
But because there's another difference, in terms of contraceptive methods.
Yeah.
And yet, again, you have the same global trend at the same time in terms of falling birth rates.
Sure.
So for me, I find these differences particularly interesting, because it's more evidence that the trend is more fundamental than things like contraception.
It's a wider trend than just one data point, right? So, and I heard from, this is anecdotal, from a friend who's another foreigner. We knew each other in the 90s here in Japan, and he said that abortion was used as a form of birth control.
Yeah.
So if you get pregnant, you get an abortion.
Yeah.
And that it's not looked down upon the way it is in the States, and it's a huge contentious issue we're not going to get into, but here it was more like, or even a married couple who has 2 children and says, well, we don't want to have a third one and you're pregnant. What do we do now? We don't have, money, space, whatever.
I have to tell you another story on the same topic, and this is, again, a very fresh story. There's an American man married to a Japanese woman who has 3 kids, and he told me that after the 3rd child, they decided not to have any more children. So he said to his wife, will I get a vasectomy? And she said, well, what's that? And he said, the clip.
Yeah.
What do you mean? The clip? Well, and she didn't know. And then he described, and she said, that sounds horrendous. Why would any man ever do that? Vasectomies are not a thing in Japan.
That's true. Well, they say pipe cut.
Oh, maybe you know more than me then.
Pipe cut.
Pipe cut. Maybe he was using the long language, but apparently he was trying to draw diagrams and explain. But it's not common, I think. Is that right? Is that your experience?
You know what? So I don't have a lot of Japanese friends, and most of my friends are foreigners, and they're married, and but it hasn't come up. Yeah, and Japanese are a lot more private.
True.
So they would never say like, oh, I'm taking a couple of days off, I'm going to get a vasectomy.
Yeah.
Whereas, in the States, you might, depending on the...
But I suspect it's actually more fundamental. I think just like you're right. Abortions were effectively a method, not of contraception. I don't want to describe it that way, but they were and a lot of doctors made a lot of money from this, which is one of the reasons I think the pill was delayed until the 90s, so I heard. But another fact, again, we're talking a lot about Japanese culture, but I like talking about this because it emphasizes how different cultural things are, but yet the trend's the same. One more fact is that epidurals are very uncommon during childbirth here.
That's true.
So there are a lot of differences on one level. Japan has some fundamental differences to other cultures, and I'm not saying what's good or bad. That's not the point. The point is
different.
The trends are the same globally. So it means that we cannot look at individual nations to say, why are the birth rates falling in the US right now? And there are studies that try to do that and come up with US reasons for why US birth rates are low. It's not... to me, it's like saying, what are the reasons that the coronavirus is having this effect in the US and having, no, this is a global phenomenon.
And there's so many factors. So it's going back to this. It's like, so there's the oil shock, and just anybody who's dated knows that during a stressful time, there's less romance, less intimacy, right? So that might be one reason. Also, stress, I believe, I've heard, causes it's more difficult to conceive when you're under stress. Other couples might just say like, okay, I wouldn't, but they're going to say, we'll abstain during this time, or we don't feel like, being intimate together.
I think the fundamental thing is during times of economic uncertainty, it's more likely that people will defer becoming a parent. So back to Japan, 74. Those who already had one child actually accelerated having the second one, and there was no change. People having 2, 3, 4, 5, zero change throughout this crisis. The big change was people who had not started a family yet.
The first-time mother.
So those are the people. I think there's enough statistical evidence to say they were deferring parenthood. It's not that they en masse, 30% of Japanese women said, you know what, there's a crisis, and actually I didn't want kids anyway. You might find a way to make that argument, but I have multiple counter-arguments to that. This was what I call unplanned childlessness. That's the terminology I've really...
You coined the term, right?
I believe so. Someone else may have thought of it somewhere else, but it was not used before. And during my journey talking to people, this is actually just something that happens.
Yeah.
It's not that, people were saying, I'm going to meet my partner at 32 and have my first child at 33. Maybe people do think that way a little bit, but you don't. There's so many uncertainties. you get through your 30s and your 40s, and there'll be people listening to this. I always empathize with people listening who may be in this position. And to those people, there are support groups or the chat groups around the podcast I've done. You will see similar comments. It's a very, very deeply emotional thing for many people.
Yeah.
But it is unplanned childlessness. I think really what we're looking at from the shocks that happen is deferred parenthood.
Yeah.
And when you defer parenthood, it means effectively you have shorter time frames in terms of fertility windows. But it also means during those years you're doing something else.
Yeah.
Okay, what are you doing? Well, you're probably accelerating your career in the workplace. And to just put it in simple terms, I think the corporate world kind of embraces that. It's natural.
Yeah.
Yes, sure. Stay with it. Defer parenthood. There's nothing from the corporate side that's bad about that. In the short term, at least. I mean, there is in the longer term for societies, and I think corporations are starting to realize that finally. And I'm part of what I'm doing now is trying to increase awareness amongst corporations and government that actually deferred parenthood is a really traumatic event for many, many people.
Yeah.
But coming back, I think the societal norm really just raises the bar as to when the timing should be. When is it almost acceptable to this corporation I take time off to have children whilst still wanting to pursue my career to the right level? That becomes a societal norm.
Yeah.
So these transitions, almost are traps. Like, okay, you're 32, 35 is a good age now.
And what happens when you hit 32 and you can't have children?
Yeah, or you haven't got a partner.
Or you haven't got a partner.
Yeah, I've just broken up, or,
oh my gosh. Well, back to Japanese families, and sorry to bring it back to Japan so much, but I was going to say, I know a Japanese probate lawyer, and how are we doing on?
25 minutes, and I can push back that call if we need to.
So, like I said, Japanese couples are very different. What I've heard anecdotally, there are actually a lot of sexless couples who are not even making love.
Sure.
And that there's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe they're not getting along, whatever happened. Or they're so busy at work that you get off work, you get home at 11 p.m. and just go into a coma until the next morning, go back to work. A lot of that.
There's a lot of reasons for that. And it's younger people as well. It's quite surprising. I think of one Japanese couple, very Japanese, didn't speak English. I met a friend of a friend, a woman, and she was dating this guy for 6 years. The first year was normal, it was a sex life. They hadn't had sex for 5 years after that. And she was a 29-year-old attractive Japanese woman. And it took me and several of her friends to say, this is not normal.
Yeah,
and
not at all.
If she wanted kids, this was a fundamental issue. This was a signal. Okay, they may have been able to have one or two romantic nights to have kids, but this was such a fundamental signal that she was not in the right relationship.
Yeah.
And after multiple discussions with, not me, but amongst her friends, she took a very brave decision to break up. And oh my gosh, the person after that, she's now dating, she's kind of, we call it here genki, just positive minded about everything. So sexlessness is a big thing, but it's also a big thing around the world. We thought this was a Japanese thing, but this is everywhere now.
Well, it happened in America. You have like 30-year-old male virgins. I mean, guys who've never had sex, never had a girlfriend.
Yeah. I wish I'd just call out to Chris Williamson's podcast, Modern Wisdom, that I was on. He's got some incredible material, statistics on the number of men under 30 who have not had sex in the past year. And it might be 20-30% of young men who have had zero sex in a year.
Wow. What a different world I grew up in. And a lot of this in Japan happens after children too. So I can see why a guy might not want to have children, because they know. A friend told me, I said, look at that guy, he's got a 5-year-old child. You know what that means? He's not had sex with his wife in 6 years. Because once they have children, they're now roommates. And he goes out and makes the money, and she stays home and takes care of the kids. So I could see some guys might think, I don't want to have kids because then our sex life is over. And that brings in the cheating culture, and it seems to be kind of expected or accepted. And
it's bizarre. It's commonplace, as you know, and it's almost normal from what I can see. But yet, when you talk to people about this, maybe there's an awkwardness about talking about it. It's just an unspoken thing that happens that, a couple gets married. And the other dynamic around this is, maybe it's changing a little bit, but oftentimes the woman is the one who looks after the family finances.
Yeah.
And the man gets like a little stipend every month. And maybe his company kind of has a expense account for some dinners out and drinks out. That still happens. But you're right, there's a separation. Again, the concept of marriage and how we think of it, I think...
Very different.
It's different here. No, not that... But I will say this. I think young women in Japan are looking for love. They want that kind of a loving... They want romance. They don't want this kind of structured relationship.
They want to be swept off their feet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, a young Japanese woman who watched the documentary some years ago, a very beautiful young woman, she was probably 28, 29 at the time, watched it and said, she was tearing up and she said, we were told there would be a Prince Charming. Where is he? So...
It's heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking.
Wow.
So for all, and we're covering a vast range of, this is not a singular thing. And again, let's just bring it back to the rest of the world. The same thing's happening everywhere. This is in the US and the UK and France and Australia and in India too. When you go to those areas in southern India, I've met women there as well who are saying, no, I have to get my education. I can't think about family. And I just know for many what will happen.
You know where that's going.
You know where it's going, yeah.
Yeah. So, and back to this. So, marriage is different, relationships are different, sex is different in Japan. Families are very different. So, I was going to say earlier, I know this probate lawyer who went to do an intake for probate lawyers write wills and estates and trusts for people, and then they dispose their assets when they pass away. So, this Japanese probate lawyer went to do this intake for this will and write this person's will. Okay, how much is your house worth? What bank accounts do you have? What stocks and financial instruments do you have? And where do you want it to go when you die? And he gives her all the information. And at the end, she says, just like a typical, customer visit, do you have any more questions for me? He said, yeah, sure. Just one. Who's going to find me when I die?
Wow. But I get it. And
as she was leaving, she noticed at the front door there was this cork board, and it had all these menus for takeout for restaurants. That's how he was eating.
And again, in the documentary, I cover loneliness, and I talk about loneliness of older people in Japan, but also Germany. And again, this is a global thing, but there's a community called Takashima here, which is in Tokyo, a suburb of Tokyo, where I went to visit with she was actually my Japanese language teacher.
Oh, cool.
She told me about this area that she remembered from her childhood that was just filled with children. There was this modern apartment blocks that went up in the 70s. And all over Japan, these went up. And she just remembers having so much fun after school, running around the playgrounds. And as she was telling me the story about it, I just thought, it's not going to be like that now. So I asked, and people asked who watched the documentary, asked me on occasion, did she really not ever go back to that place? She didn't. So she hadn't been back in 30 years.
Oh.
So there's a scene in the documentary where I go with her. That was genuinely the first time she'd been back in 30 years. And you could see her, almost childlike reaction to being and saying, and I'm looking around and there's no kids now. And she's saying, well, there's more car parking now. Those used to be like playgrounds. And she's walking through and suddenly all the stores are closed. And we go to a pharmacy and at that moment, I'm just following her. She's walking so fast, I was like, okay, talk to whoever you want or wherever you want to go. Yeah. She goes into the pharmacy and said, sorry, why are all the shops closed? And the store owner says, well, it's just old people living here now. And further to that, I think my assumption was, well, they must be kind of half empty, these apartments now. This is just what's happened. But no, it turns out that 98% are occupied. The majority are occupied by old people living alone. The majority of those are old women in their 80s and 90s, because
widows.
women live longer than men.
Yeah.
So you have exactly this scenario of people dying alone, and it turns out it's a huge issue here.
Wow.
So we could talk more about this, but
Yeah.
it's not a pleasant subject. And again, to just make the point, in Germany, where I filmed as well on the same topic, this is happening in all of these countries. Again, this is not a Japanese thing at all.
And what I find interesting, so I've been hearing this on TV for 3 decades now in Japan. Like, everybody knows that they've got this aging society. They have a word for it, korei shakai, aging society. And everybody knows, and everybody hears about it all the time, and they all, whoa, what do we do? I don't know what to do. In the documentary, I saw a few people who were surprised at their country's birth rate, right?
Oh, many.
Yeah.
Maybe
So this is like a silent epidemic, right?
Yes, it's a hidden. That's right.
Yeah.
I think that was part of what motivated me when I decided to, first think of writing a book and then a documentary. Like, people need to understand that this silent epidemic is a good way to describe it. This background problem that they hear about maybe once a year when the newspaper publishes the birth rate, that this is going to fundamentally change all aspects of society.
Yeah.
So
and it's not easy to come back from either.
It's impossible, because you don't have the number of parents. As the birth rate goes down, the next generation is shrunk, and then the next generation is shrunk. So Japan will never, in the next century and probably a lot longer, go back to a population of 120 plus million, where it's been sitting at for decades. It's going to shrink to, let's say, around half. Best case, it will stabilize there. But this shrinkage will never end until the birth rate goes back up to 2. It can't. It's mathematical.
Wow. So are there any answers? Any solutions?
Yeah.
I know it's a very complex, like I said, so many moving parts.
Yeah.
Which means we can't just say, like, okay, stop taking the pill, or get married younger, or eat better.
Yeah.
You can't just point to one thing and say, okay, that'll fix it.
Yeah.
You know?
That's exactly right. And of course, governments around the world have been trying to fix it. In South Korea, they've been spending $2 billion on programs to encourage young people to have children, and the birth rates continue to plummet.
Well, the city we're in, Minato City, gives financial assistance to parents.
Yeah, it doesn't work. Opening more maybe a good thing to give financial assistance to parents. Maybe a good thing to open more kindergartens, to more parental leave. But you look at Denmark, much of Scandinavia, but take Denmark, a country where there's 1 year paid leave off. The mother and father can take it, split whatever way they want, 6 months each, or longer for one or the other. Free education. All sorts of benefits.
Healthcare, I have a brother living in Denmark. So
okay. So
I hear all the great stuff about it.
Yeah, but yet the birth rate is, almost as low as Japan. It's 1.5, 1.6. So you can't say, it's because of this policy or this incentive.
Yeah.
So you ask the question, is there a solution? For the longest time, I was not optimistic. And I still have fears.
It's easy to be pessimistic.
Yeah, it's easy to be
You've got this massive problem, nobody knows about it, and you can't come back from it.
The optimism comes from one thing only.
Okay.
And actually has, I know I do have a lot of hope.
Okay.
It's come from when I show the documentary to younger people. I've shown it to 12-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 22-year-olds. There's shock about this.
Yeah.
There's shock that life can work out in a way that, you can't have kids at the time you want. That's just an assumption that, if I want kids, maybe I will, maybe I won't. But if I want kids, it's okay. I'll have a partner and I'll have kids. Because we don't tell them anything different. And by definition, young people, mostly have parents. So it kind of worked out somehow, for better or worse. But the parents did it somehow.
Yeah.
So by definition...
Well, so will I.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No one's saying anything different. But when they watch the documentary, the comments, the reaction is one of near... How can I say? It's Anger is not the right word. Fear is not the right word. Inspiration is not the right word. There has to be a word, I must get it, but there's this realization is probably the best way to describe it, that actually we can't just trust society to lead us on the path that we think we might want to go on. And there's another factor to be optimistic. By definition, in countries like Japan and Europe, right now, there are fewer and fewer young people to go into the workforce. The power of those younger people to say, you know what, I'm going to choose the career that gives me closest to what I think I want in life in terms of work-life balance and salary, of course, career progression, but perhaps also in terms of the ability to take leave and have less stress around economic concerns. If I have a child at a certain age, that I will lose my potential career, which is a big thing here. We should say, I mean, women coming back into the workforce after maternity, you're on a different career path at that moment in time.
Well, not only that, the childcare. I mean, it's so many different things with the childcare. So in my mind, if there are fewer customers, fewer children in daycare, the price should go down, supply and demand, right? No, what happened was they closed down. So now there are not enough places, and they got more expensive. So if you have kids, you're going to pay through the nose for childcare, and you might not get a place. So you might not be able to go back to work.
This is what I call the birthgap trap, because a younger generation that may be motivated to have more children, say, actually have more problems. There's more stress on them because they got the burden of the older generation to take care of. And take care doesn't mean going to sit down with their aging grandparents or parents and help them on a daily basis. It means that the taxes that they will pay go to support the society, to support the older people. That's how it works. And so the younger generation, I think, I encourage to be quite selfish, actually. To be honest, I think they have to think of themselves more than older people. Because if there isn't a moment where some younger generation says, wait a minute, something isn't right in these societies, and we want to restructure education pathways, career pathways, those companies and those universities, colleges, training programs that enable that are the ones that will be successful. So we have this potential dynamic that makes me optimistic that I think there will be societies around the world, and it might be Japan. It's one of the reasons I'm still here, because I think Japan is so aware of the problem. It's more likely that things could happen here. Just repeat, if a person doesn't want to have a child, we need to support that too and respect that, because I'm sensing there might be more and more tension about people who didn't have children, and a lack of understanding as to whether it's by choice or not by choice, and those pathways. We need to all come together, everybody, as a society. But younger people give me hope.
Like I said, it's data is agnostic. It's not political. It's not judgmental. It's just an observation, right? And we're running out of time, but we got 10 minutes to 1, and we should tie it off soon. But
and just by the way, I've got a 10-15 minute call probably with someone.
Okay.
I can be doing that while you're kind of breaking up.
I'm breaking it down.
And then we can go for a coffee or something. If
Let's do that. That'd be cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So a conversation we had at Blink when we first met was infertility, where people want to have children but can't, and that's devastating, and the emotional toll that takes on people. But I think younger people are usually rebellious. I think if we make it like cool or renegade or like rebellious to have kids, like, oh, look at this rebel, he's got 3 kids. Counterculture.
I feel it's entirely up to an individual. And I don't want to, maybe it's because I'm a data person, that's for others to kind of consider. But as long as it doesn't become coercive, it shouldn't be coercive to have a child. It shouldn't be coercive to have more children. It also shouldn't be coercive to have no children or less children, fewer children. I just think, given unplanned childlessness is so prevalent around the world, and the best estimates I see places around 80% of people without children did not plan to be childless. 80%. It's lower in countries going through transition, like the US right now.
Yeah.
US, people are still hoping to have children in their 30s.
Yeah.
That wave hasn't passed through yet, but it's going in the same direction. So the prevalence of this, to me, gives me hope for societies, but ultimately it's down to an individual to decide if they want children or not.
I totally agree. Where if somebody wants to have a career, wants to have children, wants to do whatever, stay home with the children, go back to work, that's up to you, I think. But so I think you're right. I think kind of what you're saying, if I understand, is that the individual has to decide, right? And also to realize, like, humans, we're pretty bad at predicting how we're going to feel in the future, right? I mean, as a child, I wanted to be a cowboy, right? I wanted to be like Johnny Cash, right? The country singer. I wanted to ride a horse, and I wanted to, but we're very bad at predicting the future. And so when I was in my late teens, I wanted to work at a bank. And then I decided, well, I'm gonna work in South America because I learned Spanish. And then I end up in Japan, and I thought, well, I want to learn Japanese. We're very bad at predicting where we're going to be in 20 years, 10 years, 5 years. Yeah. And so I think people it kind of comes down to a decision, some life planning, saying, you know what, I don't know where I'm going to be in 10 years. So I'm going to make the decision to, what does Jordan Peterson say? Find the heaviest thing you can and pick it up and lift it. So maybe people have to make that decision. Okay, I'm going to have kids. I'm going to have children. I'm going to have a family. I'm going to get married. And I'm going to, invest in my community in many ways, right? So I think, people have to make that decision themselves because, as they say, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still, right?
I think, and sure, as a child, I know I want to be an astronaut at one point, and then I dream about being lost in space, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to do that.
Maybe not.
See, I don't think it's in the conscious mind. Young people are maybe listening to this and jumping up and down saying, what's he talking about? But I think mostly younger people naturally follow the societal norm as what's been laid down for them, and that is about education.
Yeah.
As far as you can go. And then, but during that education path, you have to choose. You have to major in something. And I'm originally from the UK. If you want to go into medicine, you got to pretty much decide at age 16. Because if you don't have your final 2 years of high school studying certain things, you have no chance. And there's no comeback to generalize. So from a very young age, we're forcing people to make decisions to narrow down the options. And then having done that, society is also, well, okay, you've now got your degree in banking or finance or whatever it is. Well, you're going to go and work for a bank, or or training programs, or you've learned to do this. You're going to do this activity, and life therefore pulls people through it, forcing decisions at quite early years that are going to be in place for the rest of people's lives, effectively. Certainly working years, and through all this, I think the societal norm, because we're not telling young people anything different, is that, you'll be able to find someone at the right time. Don't worry about it. When you're 30s is a good time, and then you're married and you have kids, that's no problem. But I think, so you're right. People don't think 10, 20 years forwards with certainty. You can't do, but you're following a path that you think, well, it's going to lead me somewhere. It's okay. There's a path, and society's pushing me through it, and pulling me through it. It'll be okay, whatever ends up. Through all of that, there's no discussion. We're not teaching younger people about fertility windows, about what can happen. Yeah. And that's what I see when young people watch the documentary. I mean, it gets very emotional at points. That this realization that, maybe society hasn't, thought this through. And that's what gives me hope.
That's beautiful. What a great way to end. Stephen, thank you so much.
Thank you for the time, Chris.
Okay.